My son screamed in shock as my daughter-in-law, Renee, stood frozen with her arms still stretched out after hurling a glass of wine at my face. "You worthless old hag. When I asked for more wine, you ignored me," she yelled, slurring her words as she stumbled drunkenly around my dining room. In that instant, something inside me snapped. As a retired judge, I knew the law better than anyone, and I knew exactly how to use it to remind her who really ran this house. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to Stories of Mom Donna and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far Stories of Mom Donna travels. The evening had started out calm enough. It was just another Friday dinner I'd been hosting since my son, Caleb, and Renee moved into my home 6 months ago. Same promise every time they were saving up for a place of their own. They just needed a little more time. 6 months later, they were still under my roof. I'd made a prime rib roast that took hours in the oven. The table was set with my finest china, and the crystal glasses passed down from my grandmother sparkled beneath the chandelier's glow. These small details mattered to me. After 30 years on the bench as a criminal judge, structure and order were what kept me grounded. Renee arrived already in a mood. She came through the front door at 7:30, tossed her purse onto the couch, and went straight to the bar in the corner of the living room. She poured herself a heavy glass of red wine while ranting about work. "That idiot boss of mine keeps riding me," she said. "He made me redo the entire report because, apparently, I missed key details." She downed the glass in 3 gulps, refilled it, and only then sat down at the table. Caleb gave me an apologetic glance as he helped bring the dishes over. My son had always been like that peacekeeper, avoider of conflict. During dinner, I tried to steer the conversation towards something normal, his work at the vet clinic, a book I'd been reading, anything to lighten the tension radiating from Renee. But every time I spoke, she cut in with a snide comment or rolled her eyes like a teenager instead of a 32-year-old woman. With every interruption came another pour of wine. By the 3rd bottle, I decided I'd had enough. When she held out her empty glass toward me like I was her waitress, I said calmly, "I think you've had enough for tonight, Renee." She froze mid-motion, glass raised, eyes locked on me in disbelief. "What?" I repeated. "I said you've had enough. This is my house, and I won't let you get drunk like this at my table." It was like lighting a fuse. Her face flushed crimson not just from the alcohol, but from fury that had been simmering for months. "Your house?" She laughed bitterly. "Just because we have to live in this old museum with you doesn't mean you can treat us like kids." Caleb reached out to her arm. "Renee, please." She yanked away. "No, Caleb, I'm done. Your mother treats us like we don't belong here, like we're intruding on her precious hardwood floors." She turned to me. "Do you know what your problem is? You can't handle the fact that you're not Judge Judith Whitmore anymore. You're just a lonely, retired old woman who has to control everyone around her to feel important." I stayed composed. Decades in court had trained me not to react to provocation. "If that's how you feel," I said, "maybe it's time you find somewhere else to live." "Mom!" Caleb cried, horrified. Renee smiled coldly. "Servants shouldn't talk back to their superiors." She thrust the glass toward me again. "Now, pour me more wine." No, that was all it took. In a flash, Renee hurled the glass straight at my face. It hit my right temple and shattered. Pain exploded through my head, followed by the warmth of blood running down my cheek. Caleb screamed. Renee stood frozen, breathing hard, shocked by what she'd done but showing not an ounce of remorse. I touched my temple and saw my fingers stained red. The silence in the room was unbearable. 30 years sending criminals to prison, and now here I was bleeding at my own dining table. "Caleb," I said evenly, though my voice trembled inside, "take your wife to her room, now." He rushed to drag her upstairs, their footsteps echoing until a door slammed shut. I went to the bathroom and examined the cut in the mirror. It wasn't deep, but it bled heavily, as head wounds do. As I rinsed it with cold water, my mind started working like a prosecutor building a case. I documented everything, took photos of the cut, the blood on my blouse, the glass shards scattered on the floor. I gathered every fragment into a plastic bag. Evidence. 30 years in the justice system had taught me that evidence is everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sitting in my office with an ice pack pressed to my temple, I began to form a plan. Not revenge. Revenge is emotional, reckless. What I wanted was justice, I needed to protect my son and my home. Just after midnight, with a purplish bruise already forming on my temple, I picked up the phone. Savannah Metro Police Department. How can I help you? I want to report an assault. The officer arrived around 7:30 a.m., sunlight slipping through the curtains. Renee and Caleb were still asleep upstairs after the chaos of the night before. I opened the door to a middle-aged man with gray at his temples. Good morning, ma'am. I'm Sergeant Nolan Graves. I got a call about an assault. I invited him in and led him to the dining room, where I had carefully left the broken glass pieces, labeled with small numbered tags I made during the night. It happened here, I said quietly, not wanting to wake the two upstairs. My daughter-in-law threw this glass at my face after I refused to pour her more wine. She'd already had too much. I showed him the photos on my phone, the cut on my temple, the blood on my blouse. The officer took notes with a professional calm. Is the assailant still in the residence? He asked. Yes, upstairs with my son. Do you wish to file a formal complaint? I hesitated for only a second, thinking of Caleb. But then I remembered Renee's face. When she threw that glass, the certainty that she could do it and face no consequence. Yes, officer, I want to file a formal complaint. We sat at the kitchen table as he filled out the report, full name of the aggressor, our relationship, a detailed account of the incident. I answered in the same tone I once used to hand down sentences, clear, firm, emotionless. We were nearly done when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Caleb appeared in the doorway, eyes puffy with sleep that quickly turned to alarm when he saw the officer. Mom, what's going on? Before I could respond, Renee stepped in behind him, confusion twisting to anger when she noticed the bandage on my temple and the policeman at the table. What the hell is this? She demanded. The officer stood. Mrs. Renee Larkin, I'm here to investigate an assault complaint regarding an incident in this residence last night. Caleb stared at me in disbelief. You called the police on Renee? She assaulted me, Caleb. She threw a glass at my face and cut me. My tone was steady, unapologetic. It was an accident. She was drunk, Caleb cried. Being intoxicated isn't a legal defense for physical assault, sir, the officer said evenly. Renee stepped closer, fists clenched. You can't be serious. This is ridiculous. It was just a family argument. A family argument that resulted in physical injury, I replied calmly. And in my own home, added the officer. Ma'am, I'll need you to come down to the station to give a statement. What? She shouted. You're arresting me over a broken glass? At this moment, I'm only asking for a statement. Depending on the evidence, charges of battery could follow. Caleb's eyes welled with tears, darting between me and the officer. Please, Mom, don't do this. We can fix this within the family. I looked at him, my heart aching in a way that had nothing to do with the bruise. Caleb, we've been trying to fix this for 6 months. Last night, she crossed the line. The officer told Renee to get dressed. She stomped upstairs, with Caleb chasing after her, begging her to calm down. For a few minutes, it was just me and the officer. He gave me a look I'd seen before, the kind of expression seasoned cops wear when trying to make sense of a family's chaos. Ma'am, are you sure you want to proceed? Family situations can be. Officer, I said, cutting him off politely. I worked 30 years as a criminal judge. I know exactly what I'm doing and what comes next. He seemed surprised, then nodded respectfully. Renee came down a few minutes later in jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled into a rushed ponytail. Caleb followed, still crying quietly. This isn't over, Renee said as she passed me. You'll regret this. The officer warned her not to make threats, which only fueled her anger. As he escorted her outside, Caleb turned to me, his face red and wet. How could you do this? She's my wife. And I'm your mother, I said simply. And this is my home. The door closed behind them, and the house fell into silence again. Caleb stared at me for a long moment as if I were a stranger, then ran upstairs. I heard the bedroom door slam. I sank into the armchair in the living room, utterly drained. The bruise throbbed, but the pain was almost a relief compared to the ache in my chest from seeing my son's face. Still, I felt no regret. Years in the courtroom had taught me that justice doesn't always look kind when it's first delivered. 2 hours later, Caleb came down with a backpack. His expression was resolute, though his eyes were still swollen. I'm going to pick up Renee at the station. We'll stay at Dana's place until we figure things out. Dana was a friend of theirs who lived in a cramped downtown apartment. It wasn't a permanent fix, and we both knew it. "Caleb," I began gently, "you don't have to go. This is your home too." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "This house stopped being mine the second you decided to call the police on my wife. She assaulted me, Caleb, right at my own dinner table. She was drunk and lost control. People make mistakes, and people must face the consequences of those mistakes," I said, my voice steadying, "especially when those mistakes involve violence." Caleb shook his head. "It's always the same with you, the unbending judge. The law above everything, even your own son." That cut deeper than the wound on my temple, but I didn't let it show. "I'm doing this because I love you, Caleb. Renee is abusive, and you're trapped in that relationship. Don't you dare analyze my marriage. You've hated Renee from day one. You've always thought I deserved better. You do deserve better," I said calmly. "You deserve someone who respects you and respects your family." He snatched the car keys from the coffee table. "I'm going to get my wife. Then we'll come back for the rest of our things." When the door closed, I exhaled a long, heavy breath. The house was quiet again, but not the comforting kind of quiet. I cherished it was heavy, thick with consequence. I drifted through the day in a fog, caught between guilt and certainty. Had I done the right thing, or had I just lost my son for good? The questions circled endlessly as I tried to read, to eat, to think of anything else. That night, the phone rang. It was Caleb. "We're at Dana's place. Renee was released with a summons for a hearing next week." His voice was cold, distant. "We'll come by tomorrow to get our stuff." "Caleb, you don't have to. I've already made up my mind, Mom. I'm standing by my wife." After he hung up, I sat at my desk and opened a new folder on my computer. I titled it Case Renee. Inside, I began organizing every document, every piece of evidence, every decision made. For 30 years, I'd built cases against criminals of every kind. Now, I was building one to save my son from a destructive marriage, even if, for now, he despised me for it. The next morning, while waiting for them to come collect their belongings, I called an old friend. Frank and I had worked together for years, he as a detective, me as a judge. He'd retired before I did, and now ran a small private investigation agency. "Jude, how long has it been?" His deep voice carried a warmth that instantly steadied me. "What brings you to me?" "I need your help, Frank. It's a delicate matter." I explained everything: the assault, the police report, the fight with Caleb. "I need to know more about Renee. Something about her doesn't add up, especially financially." Frank didn't waste time with small talk. "Send me her info. I'll handle it quietly." An hour later, I parked 2 blocks away from my house and waited. I didn't want to be there when they came for their things. A confrontation would only make things worse. From where I sat, I saw Caleb's car pull up. He and Renee went inside using the key he still had. I stayed there nearly 2 hours, catching glimpses of them through the windows, moving back and forth, packing quickly. When they finally left, the car was packed full. Caleb looked back at the house one last time before getting in, and even from that distance, I could see he was crying. Renee, on the other hand, looked annoyed, gesturing angrily as she spoke. I waited 20 more minutes before returning home. Their absence felt like something tangible: spaces where things used to be, silence where voices used to fill the air. The guest room they'd occupied was half empty. The furniture remained, but all their personal belongings were gone. In the closet, I noticed one of my jewelry pieces missing a gold brooch that had belonged to my mother. Caleb knew how much it meant to me. Was it a mistake or a small act of spite? I chose to believe the former. The next few days were painfully quiet. Caleb didn't call, didn't answer my messages. I tried to give him space, but each day of silence felt like its own punishment. Then, on Wednesday, Frank's first report arrived. Sitting at my desk, I opened the attachment with a knot in my stomach. The findings were worse than I expected. Renee had been fired 3 months ago. She hadn't just been arguing with her boss as she'd claimed she'd lost her job and kept it a secret from everyone, even Caleb. But that was only the beginning. She had 5 credit cards, all maxed out, totaling almost $800,000 in debt. 2 of those cards were in Caleb's name, likely opened using his information or a forged signature. Even worse, there had been 3 major withdrawals from Caleb's retirement account over the past 2 months, totaling $400,000. To make those transactions, Renee would have needed his passwords or his forged approval. The report also mentioned smaller incidents, bounced checks, complaints from local stores, and an eviction notice from a previous apartment they'd never spoken about. The most disturbing part was the social media screenshots showing Renee chatting with her friends about inheriting a house soon when the old lady kicks the bucket. The old lady being me. A wave of nausea hit me. This wasn't just a temper problem or a disrespectful daughter-in-law. It was a calculated plan. Renee was bleeding my son dry financially while imagining a future built on my death. I printed Frank's report and locked it in a secure file. I needed more information before confronting Caleb. I called Frank again. Keep digging, especially into those retirement withdrawals. If you can prove she took that money without Caleb's consent, we may be looking at fraud or worse. I'm on it, he said. And Jude, be careful. If she's desperate for money and thinks she has something to gain from you, he didn't need to finish. 30 years in criminal law taught me that money drives desperate people to do dangerous things. That night, I changed the locks. It felt like a necessary form of self-preservation. The following week was the preliminary hearing for the assault. I walked into the same courthouse where I'd spent decades working, this time as the victim. Sitting on the opposite side of the bench was surreal. Former colleagues greeted me with concern, and I caught whispers in the hallways. Renee arrived with her attorney, a nervous young man in a wrinkled suit who looked barely out of law school. Caleb wasn't with her, which surprised me. I had expected him to stand by her side. The presiding judge was Miriam Cole, a competent woman I'd known casually during my last years before retirement. She recognized me immediately and gave me a discreet nod. The proceedings were brief. The prosecutor outlined the charge of misdemeanor battery. Renee's lawyer argued it was an isolated incident brought on by stress and alcohol, that she had no criminal history and was deeply remorseful. Your Honor, he said, my client has no prior record and is sincerely sorry for what happened. We ask for a community service sentence instead of jail time. When it was my turn, I rose with the same posture I had held for decades in that courtroom. Your Honor, I'm not seeking revenge or harsh punishment. I'm asking for justice and protection. The assault happened in my home, at my dinner table, from someone I took in out of kindness. I respectfully request that, in addition to any other measures, a restraining order be issued preventing the defendant from approaching my residence. I saw the color drain from Renee's face. A restraining order would mean she couldn't return to my house, the same house where she and Caleb had been living, the house she clearly had plans for. The judge paused, considering, then delivered her ruling. Given the circumstances and relationship between the parties, I order the defendant to complete 6 months of community service and attend an anger management program. Additionally, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order prohibiting the defendant from approaching within 100 yards of the victim or her residence for 90 days, after which the court will review the matter. Renee's lawyer tried to argue the restriction was excessive, but Judge Cole was unmoved. Domestic violence is not minimized by family ties, she said firmly. As I left the courtroom, I noticed Caleb sitting at the back. Our eyes met for a fleeting second before he looked away and hurried out to join Renee in the hallway. I wanted to reach out, explain what I'd found, tell him everything, but it wasn't the right moment. He wasn't ready to hear it. Back home, I added the hearing transcript and the restraining order to my Case Renee folder. The file was getting thicker, both literally and in meaning. 2 days later, an unexpected call came from Caleb. Mom, he said, his voice weary and hollow. We need to talk. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop, neutral ground. I arrived early and chose a corner table where we wouldn't be overheard. Caleb showed up right on time, thinner, pale, with dark shadows under his eyes. He wore a turtleneck, despite the warm day, an immediate red flag. Are you all right? I asked as he sat down. I'm managing, he said, avoiding my eyes as he picked up the menu. We ordered coffee black for me, with milk for him, like always. When the waitress left, silence hung between us until he finally spoke. The restraining order makes everything harder, he said quietly. We've been staying at Dana's for almost 2 weeks. The couch is killing my back, and her patience is wearing thin. Couldn't you rent a place? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He gave a dry laugh. With what money? My paycheck barely covers the basics, and Renee... He paused, staring down at his hands. Renee hasn't found another job yet. So he still believed that lie. I took a slow sip of coffee, trying to figure out the best way to approach it. If I confronted him head-on, he'd shut down completely. "Caleb, if you're struggling financially, I can help you, just you." He finally looked me in the eye. "What does that mean?" "Just me? It means I'm worried about you, and I want to make sure you're okay, but my help comes with conditions." His tone hardened. "What kind of conditions?" "I want you to review your accounts, checking, savings, retirement, credit cards, everything." Caleb frowned. "Why would I do that?" "Because I believe you don't actually know what's going on with your money." "What are you talking about?" He set his cup down too hard, coffee splashing onto the table. "If this is your way of turning me against Renee, it's not an attempt," I said gently, cutting him off. "It's a warning, based on facts." "Caleb, when was the last time you checked your retirement account?" His expression shifted, a flicker of doubt breaking through. "I don't know. A few months ago, maybe. It's set up for automatic deposits." "And withdrawals?" I asked. "Did you approve any recently?" He froze. "What? Withdrawals?" I pulled a folded sheet from my purse, a statement from his retirement fund that Frank had obtained, and placed it in front of him. The printout showed 3 large withdrawals made over the past 2 months. Caleb picked it up, his hands trembling as he read. "This can't be right. I never authorized these." "There's more," I said softly, pulling out additional documents, credit card statements in his name, with charges he clearly hadn't made, luxury purchases, and transfers to unknown accounts. Caleb skimmed through them, his breathing quickening. "How did you even get this?" "I hired a private investigator. After Renee attacked me, I knew something was seriously wrong." "You investigated my wife?" he shouted, voice cracking with anger. "I investigated to protect you," I said firmly. "And it turns out I was right. Caleb, Renee lost her job 3 months ago. You've got 5 credit cards maxed out, 2 of them in your name. She took $400,000 from your retirement account without your consent. That's a felony." Caleb closed his eyes, inhaled shakily, then opened them again. His face was torn between disbelief and realization. "The bills," he whispered. "She always said she was paying them, but there was never enough left. I thought it was because my salary was low, that we were just scraping by. She's been stealing from you, son." He shook his head weakly. "No, there has to be another explanation. Maybe she panicked after losing her job. Maybe she didn't want me to worry. Maybe she planned to pay it back when things got better." "Caleb," I said softly, "there's something else you need to see." I handed him the last document screenshots of Renee's messages to her friends, where she joked about inheriting a house soon when the old lady kicks the bucket, and putting up with the old woman a few more months until we're in the clear financially. Caleb read them once, then again, as if trying to reject the words on the page. Then I saw something in him broke. A single tear slid down his face, followed by another. "She always told me you hated her because you were old-fashioned, because you couldn't accept us. That's why you were so cold." "Caleb, I never cared who you loved," I said quietly. "I cared about how they treated you." He wiped his face with a napkin. "When we moved in, she said it would just be temporary, until we saved enough for our own place. But there was always some new expense, some excuse. She said we were saving, but I never saw the money." I reached across the table and took his hand. "And that turtleneck, it's too hot today. Take it off." Caleb went pale and tugged the collar higher. "It's nothing." "Is it her?" I asked softly. "Has she hurt you too?" His eyes filled with tears again. Slowly, he lowered the collar, revealing faint bruises and fading fingerprints along his neck. "It happened after the hearing," he whispered. "She was furious about the restraining order. She said I should have defended her, that I chose you over her." His voice cracked. "I'm scared, Mom." The anger that surged inside me was unlike anything I'd felt before, raw, protective, primal, but I forced myself to stay calm. He needed steadiness, not rage. "You're coming home with me tonight," I said firmly. "She's still barred by the restraining order, so you'll be safe. We'll send someone later to get your things. What matters now is getting you out of that situation. She'll lose it when she finds out I left." "That's exactly why you have to," I said. "This is a pattern, Caleb, a classic cycle of abuse." He sat in silence for a long while, staring at the papers in front of him, the undeniable proof of Renee's betrayal. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "Okay, let's go home." The drive was quiet. Caleb stared out the window the whole way, his reflection pale in the glass. It wasn't until I parked in the garage that he finally spoke. How did I let this happen? How did I not see it? Abuse doesn't start loud, I said, shutting off the engine. It starts small little lies, tiny manipulations, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're already caught in it. We stepped inside the house, the same one he'd grown up in, the one that had always been his too. Caleb paused in the middle of the living room, looking around as if he were seeing it for the first time. I'll get your room ready, I said, heading upstairs. His old room was untouched, just as I'd kept it since he left for college, and even after he and Renee moved into the guest room. It was a piece of the past, a safe space waiting for him to come back. I changed the sheets, opened the windows, and set fresh flowers on the nightstand. Small gestures to remind him he was home. When I went back down, he was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. She's called 12 times, he said, looking up, and sent 20 texts, asking where I am. You don't need to answer her. I have to. If I ignore her, she'll come here restraining order or not. He typed a short message. I need some time to think. I'm safe. Please don't come looking for me today. Seconds later, the phone lit up with her name. Caleb declined the call, his hands trembling, then turned the phone off. What do I do now? He asked quietly. One thing at a time, I said, sitting beside him. First, we secure your finances. Tomorrow, we'll change your banking passwords and notify the bank about the unauthorized withdrawals. Then we'll meet with an attorney to go over your options. Legal options, he repeated, as if the words tasted foreign. You mean divorce, among other things. The money she took, the credit cards in your name, those are financial crimes. Whether you press charges is your choice, but we have to stop her from doing more damage. Caleb nodded slowly. I never thought I'd end up here. I always believed I'd see it coming if someone ever abused me. No one does, I said softly. That's how it works. It hides itself. It makes you question your own judgment. That evening, I cooked while Caleb took a long shower. We ate in silence, but it was a different silence this time, one of calm, of slow healing. Before bed, he hugged me for the first time in weeks. Thank you for not giving up on me, he whispered. I never would, I said, holding him close. Later that night, I could hear him crying softly in his room. The sound tore at me, but beneath the heartbreak was relief. He was home. He was safe. The tears meant he was beginning to heal. The next morning, we went to the bank. Caleb canceled all his cards, changed his passwords, and froze every account. We started the process of disputing the retirement withdrawals. The bank manager, after hearing the story and reviewing the evidence, strongly recommended that he file a formal fraud complaint. We'll think about it, Caleb said quietly. That afternoon, we met with a family law attorney named Rebecca Owens, a woman in her 50s with calm authority and kind eyes. Based on what you've shown me, she said, reviewing the documents, you have strong grounds for divorce due to misconduct. The financial abuse is well documented, and with evidence of physical harm, we can pursue a permanent protective order to replace the temporary one currently in effect. Caleb hesitated. What if I don't want her to go to jail? That's completely up to you, Rebecca said gently. It's common for victims to feel conflicted. We can focus on the divorce and protecting your assets first. The criminal part can come later, when you're ready. When we left, Caleb looked drained but lighter. It feels like I'm waking up from a bad dream, he said as we drove home. It's a process, I told him. It won't happen overnight. I know, he said, but at least I'm finally moving forward. That night, around 10, a sudden pounding on the front door shattered the calm. The bell rang again and again, echoing through the house. Caleb and I locked eyes from the couch where we'd been watching a movie. It's her, he whispered, his voice trembling. She can't get in, I said, grabbing my phone. And she's violating the restraining order. I'm calling the police. The banging grew louder as I spoke to the 911 dispatcher. My daughter-in-law is violating a restraining order. She's trying to force her way into my home. We need an officer here immediately. From outside, Renee's voice cut through the night. Caleb! I know you're in there. Open this door right now! Renee's voice tore through the night. Caleb shrank on the couch, shaking. I moved closer and held his hands. It's okay. She can't get in. The police are on their way. Outside, Renee alternated between screaming, begging, and cursing. The noise drew the neighbors' attention. Porch lights flicked on up and down the street, blinds shifted, Faces appeared in windows. When the patrol car pulled up 7 minutes later, she was still pounding on the door, shouting Caleb's name. We watched from the window as the officers handcuffed her for violating the restraining order. Even as they led her to the cruiser, she kept yelling, twisting to glare back at the house. "What's going to happen to her now?" Caleb whispered. "They'll hold her for breaking the order," I said quietly. "That's a serious charge." That night, he slept in my room like he used to when he was little, restless and haunted. Only this time, the nightmare wasn't inside, it was being driven away in the back of a police car. The next morning, a detective handling the case called. Renee would stay in custody until her bail hearing the next day. Given the recent history of violence and her instability, the judge will likely impose strict release conditions, he said. Possibly an ankle monitor and mandatory supervision. I thanked him and hung up, relief and unease, twisting together in my chest. Caleb was still asleep, drained from everything that had happened. I made breakfast, left a note, and headed to meet Frank, my investigator friend. We met at his small downtown office. His face was grim the moment I walked in. "Jude, we found more on Renee's stuff you need to see." He laid a stack of papers on the table. Police records from 2 different cities, both involving her in domestic violence and financial fraud. "She's done this before," he said. "In Atlanta 5 years ago, and in Dallas 3 years later. Both times, she targeted people with money, moved in, took control of their finances, and when things got tense, it turned violent." A chill ran through me. What happened in those cases? In the first, the victim dropped the charges after she promised to change. In the second, there was a private settlement. The man paid her a large sum to disappear. I stared at the documents. "She's a serial predator. And Caleb's just her latest victim." Frank nodded. "There's more," he added carefully. "We found searches she made about life insurance and inheritance, specifically how to secure spousal rights to property." My stomach tightened. "Are you saying she might have been planning something?" "I can't say that for sure," he said. "But the pattern is alarming. She drained Caleb's accounts, knew you had assets and property, and combined with those comments about the old lady kicking the bucket, it paints a dark picture." I left his office with the folder heavy in my hands and my heart heavier still. What began as a single act of violence had evolved into something far more dangerous. When I got home, Caleb was in the kitchen boiling water. "Where were you?" he asked. "Meeting with the investigator," I said, setting the folder on the counter. "We need to talk." He turned off the stove and looked at me warily. "More bad news?" "Important news," I corrected. "Please, sit down." I spread the documents out and explained what Frank had uncovered. Caleb read silently, his expression shifting from disbelief to hurt, then anger, and finally, cold understanding. "So I wasn't special," he said bitterly. "Just convenient." "You were a target," I said softly. "That's what people like her do. They look for good, trusting people and use them." Caleb rubbed his face, exhaling hard. "What do we do now?" "We go to the lawyer and the police. This evidence strengthens both the divorce and the criminal case." "Her bail hearing's tomorrow, right?" "Yes." "I don't have to go, do I?" he asked, then shook his head. "Actually, I want to. I need to see her face and know she can't hurt me anymore." His resolve startled me. In just a few days, he had gone from a terrified victim to someone ready to fight back. That afternoon, we laid out every detail of our plan. First, he filed for a contested divorce, citing financial and physical abuse, supported by all the evidence we'd gathered. Then, with Rebecca's help, he submitted formal complaints for financial fraud and unauthorized withdrawals from his retirement account. Rebecca reviewed each document meticulously. "We'll make this case airtight," she said firmly, "so airtight that she won't find a single way out." The combination of civil and criminal cases would put enormous pressure on her. The next morning, we got ready for the bail hearing. Caleb wore a simple outfit, black slacks, and a crisp white shirt, the kind of thing you'd wear to a job interview when you want to make a good impression. I chose one of my old judge's suits, a quiet reminder to the courtroom of who I used to be. The courthouse was nearly empty when we arrived with Rebecca. We sat quietly in the back, trying not to draw attention. Caleb gripped my hand so tightly his fingers were icy, despite the warmth of the day. When Renee was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, he sucked in a breath. It was the first time he'd seen her since the night she tried to break in. Renee scanned the courtroom until her eyes found us. For a brief second, her face softened when she saw Caleb, but when she noticed our joined hands, Her expression twisted into rage. She muttered something to her attorney, who shook his head in defeat. The judge entered, and the hearing began. The prosecutor laid out the charges: blatant violation of a restraining order, a pattern of recent violence, and the risk of intimidation. Furthermore, Your Honor, he added, we have reason to believe the defendant has a prior history of similar conduct, including domestic violence and fraud cases in Atlanta and Dallas. Renee jerked toward her lawyer, stunned. She clearly hadn't expected her past to surface so quickly. Her public defender argued that she had local ties, wasn't a flight risk, and could safely await trial out of custody. The judge listened with little expression, then delivered the decision. Given the seriousness of the offense, the defendant's prior record, and the clear danger posed to the victims, the court orders the defendant to remain in custody until trial, subject to review in 30 days if an appropriate supervision plan is presented. Renee gasped, her lawyer whispering for her to stay quiet as the deputies approached. She turned to Caleb, eyes wide and desperate. Please, she cried, don't let this happen, Caleb. I love you. We can fix this. He didn't respond. He just met her eyes, calm and steady, and watched as she was led away. When it was over, he exhaled deeply in the hallway. I thought it would hurt more, he admitted. Seeing her like that, hearing her beg. But all I could think about was what we found the others, the lies, the inheritance searches. You were strong, I said, pride swelling in my chest. I don't feel strong, he confessed. I feel stupid for not seeing it sooner. You're not stupid, I said. You were deceived by someone who made deception her craft. On the way home, we stopped at a hardware store. Caleb decided to repaint his room, a small act of reclaiming his life. He picked a pale blue, like the sky after a storm, he said. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. We spent mornings handling paperwork, legal meetings, and visits to the bank, and evenings painting, moving furniture, and turning his old room into a space of peace again. 2 weeks later, the bank notified us that the disputed retirement withdrawals had been approved. The $400,000 would be returned to Caleb's account, and the bank would cooperate fully in the criminal investigation. It's a start, he said. One step at a time, right? Exactly, I answered. That afternoon, while we painted the ceiling, Caleb suddenly said, You know what's hardest to accept? It's not the money or the lies or even the violence. It's realizing the last 2 years were built on an illusion that the person I loved never really existed. I climbed off the ladder and sat on the edge of the bed, still covered in drop cloths. Grieving what you thought you had is sometimes harder than grieving what you actually lost. Caleb nodded, lowering himself beside me. How do I move forward after this? How do I ever trust again? Slowly, I said. Carefully, with people who truly care about you. And by remembering this doesn't define you or your worth. He rested his head on my shoulder, leaving a smudge of blue paint on my old t-shirt. I didn't care. Thank you for not giving up on me, he murmured. Even when I pushed you away, even when I chose wrong. That's what mothers do, I said quietly. We wait until our children are ready to listen, and then we help them rebuild. A month passed, and life began to steady. Caleb returned to his full-time job at the veterinary clinic. I went back to my retired routines: morning reading, afternoons in the garden, occasional dinners with friends. The criminal case moved slowly, as they always do, but Renee stayed in custody. Her second bail request was denied after investigators uncovered more of her past crimes. Caleb began therapy twice a week, working through what had left him vulnerable and learning how to recognize and build healthier relationships. Some nights, I still heard him crying in his room, but those moments were becoming fewer, softer. One Saturday afternoon, while we were preparing lunch together, a new ritual that had quietly become our comfort, the phone rang. It was Rebecca, the attorney. I have news, she said. Renee's lawyer just reached out with a plea offer. Caleb put her on speaker so I could listen. What kind of offer? He asked. She'll plead guilty to the financial crimes and the restraining order violation in exchange for a reduced sentence, 2 years in prison and 3 years of supervised probation. She's also agreeing to a no-contest divorce, giving up any claim to your assets or your mother's estate. Caleb looked at me, searching for guidance. What do you think? It's your choice, I said. But 2 years behind bars and 3 on probation is a serious punishment. More importantly, it means she's admitting guilt. And if I say no, he asked Rebecca, Then we go to trial, she explained. With the evidence we have, I'm confident we could get 4 or 5 years, maybe more. But trials are unpredictable, and you'd have to testify publicly, reliving everything. Caleb sighed deeply. Can I think about it? Of course, Rebecca said. They've given us 3 days to respond. After we hung up, Caleb quietly went back to chopping vegetables. I didn't push him. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. I don't know if I want her locked up for 5 years. It's not about revenge. But I don't know if 2 years is enough for me to feel safe when she's out. Supervised probation isn't just paperwork, I told him. She'd have to check in regularly, stay away from you, attend therapy and rehab. Any slip-up, she's back in prison. Caleb nodded slowly. And the divorce would go faster if she doesn't contest? Much faster, I said, and with a lot less emotional strain. He stared at the cutting board for a while. I'll think about it, he said. I want to make the right call for the right reasons. 2 days later, he asked me to go with him to Rebecca's office. I've decided, he said as soon as we sat down. I want to take the deal, not because it's easier, but because it's fair. 2 years in prison, 3 on probation, and an uncontested divorce. It's justice, not revenge. Rebecca smiled warmly. That's a sound decision, Caleb. I'll notify the prosecutor and her attorney today. Things moved quickly after that. A week later, we were back in court for the plea hearing. It was the first time Caleb had seen Renee since the bail hearing a month earlier. She looked like she had aged years. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on her thinner frame, and her hair was streaked with gray at the roots. When she spotted us walking in, her eyes locked onto Caleb, sharp and unsettling. The judge went over the agreement carefully before addressing her directly. Mrs. Moore, do you understand that by pleading guilty, you are admitting to committing financial fraud, assault, and violating a court order? Yes, Your Honor, Renee said, her voice hoarse. And are you doing so voluntarily, fully aware of the consequences? Yes. Very well, the judge said. This court accepts your guilty plea and sentences you to 2 years in state custody, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. During probation, you are forbidden from any contact with the victims, must complete anger management and substance abuse treatment, and comply with the financial restitution outlined in the civil agreement. The gavel came down, and it was over. As the officers moved to escort her away, Renee turned toward us one last time. Caleb, she called out, ignoring the guard's warning. I'm sorry for everything. Caleb didn't answer. He held her gaze for a brief moment, then looked away. That was the closure he needed, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the quiet finality of an ending. In the hallway, after it was done, Caleb let go of my hand and exhaled. I thought it would be harder, he said, seeing her like that, hearing her plead, but all I could think of was everything we found. The other victims, the lies, the searches. You were incredibly strong, I told him, my chest swelling with pride. I don't feel strong, he admitted. I feel foolish for believing her, for missing the signs. You're not foolish, I said. You were deceived by someone who made deception her profession. On the way home, we stopped at the hardware store. Caleb decided to repaint his room, a small, symbolic act of starting over. He chose a soft blue, almost sky blue. Like the sky after a storm, he said. The following days took on a rhythm that was almost healing. We spent our days handling legal paperwork, meetings, and errands, and our nights repainting his room, rearranging furniture, and reclaiming his space, turning it into a refuge again. 3 months after meeting Rebecca, Caleb received an invitation to speak at a state conference on domestic violence. He was nervous, unsure if he was ready to tell his story. What if I'm not eloquent enough? He asked one evening as we practiced his speech in the living room. What if I freeze up and look like a complete amateur? Caleb asked, pacing nervously. Then you take a breath, take a sip of water, and keep going, I told him. You're not there to give a perfect speech. You're there to tell the truth, and that truth might save someone else's life. On the day of the conference, I sat among the audience, watching my son step onto the stage. He wore a sleek navy suit, his hair neatly tied back, his posture calm and steady. My name is Caleb Moore, he began, and today I want to tell you how a shattered wine glass saved my life. For 40 minutes, he held the room spellbound, his voice steady as he recounted his experience. His pain raw yet controlled. He spoke about how abuse isn't always physical, how financial control can destroy a person from the inside, and how the system often overlooks it. He ended with a call to strengthen laws, raise awareness, and educate communities. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet in a long, thunderous ovation. I felt tears welling not of sadness, but of indescribable pride. My son had turned his suffering into strength, his scars into purpose. After the talk, as we were gathering our things, a well-dressed older woman approached, her conference badge identifying her as part of a philanthropic foundation. "Mr. Moore, your presentation was remarkable," she said warmly. "I'm deeply impressed by the work you and your organization are doing. I'd love to discuss potential funding to expand Safe New Beginnings." Caleb turned to me, eyes wide with disbelief and excitement. I smiled and nodded. "That would be incredible," he said. "We have so many ideas, especially for reaching survivors in rural areas where resources are scarce." They exchanged business cards and set a meeting for the following week. As we walked to the parking lot, Caleb's energy was contagious. "Can you believe it?" he said, practically glowing. "Actual funding. We could create multilingual materials, build a secure app for survivors, maybe even open a small office." "You've earned this, Caleb," I said, meaning every word. "You've worked hard, and you're helping more people than you realize." He stopped suddenly and pulled me into a tight hug. "None of this would have happened without you, Mom. Without your courage that night, your determination after, your support through all of it." I hugged him back, overwhelmed by that bittersweet mix only mothers understand: pride and nostalgia, love and release. "You always had that strength," I whispered. "You just had to find it again." That night, driving home alone after dropping him off at his new apartment, I let my thoughts drift over the past year: the broken glass, the police call, the discovery of the fraud, Renee's arrest, Caleb's slow healing, and now this new beginning. It struck me how one violent moment, as terrible as it was, had become the spark that led to justice, renewal, and purpose. That glass hadn't just shattered, it had broken the hold Renee had over my son, the web of lies that bound him, and the illusion that abuse only happens to other people. In its place, we built something stronger, a bond between mother and son, and a shared mission to turn pain into hope. When I got home, I parked in the garage, turned on the lights, and was greeted by silence, not the heavy silence of loneliness or fear, but the peaceful kind that comes after a long storm has passed. I made a cup of tea and sat on the deck beneath a blanket of stars, thinking of something Caleb's therapist once said during a joint session. "Sometimes we have to break completely before we can rebuild stronger." Like that shattered glass, our family had fractured, but what we created from the pieces was sturdier, truer, and infinitely more precious than what came before. It's been almost 2 years since the night that changed everything. The night a wine glass shattered against my face and, in a strange twist of fate, put my entire life back together. Some people call it luck, others call it karma, but I've come to think of it as clarity. Sometimes it takes something breaking loudly, painfully, for the truth to echo clear enough to be heard. The house feels different now. Not empty, not haunted, just quieter in a way that feels earned. I still live in the same 2-story home in Coral Gables, with its creaking wooden floors and ivy-covered porch. The garden is fuller than ever. I spend my mornings pruning roses and talking to the cardinals that come to perch near the lemon tree. Retirement used to feel like a slow fade, a quiet retreat from relevance. But after everything that happened with Carly and Andy, I discovered that stillness doesn't have to mean invisibility. It can mean peace. Andy moved into a small townhouse across town, closer to the veterinary clinic, where he now manages a full team. He's doing well, really well. His program, Safe New Beginnings, has grown beyond anything either of us imagined. What started as a small support circle for survivors of financial and emotional abuse now partners with shelters and law firms across the state. Every few months, he travels to different cities to give talks, sometimes even out of state. He sends me photos him on stage, speaking to crowds, the same kid who once trembled giving a school presentation now standing tall, commanding rooms full of strangers. Last week, he called to say the foundation that approached him at the conference officially approved a long-term grant. They'll be opening a Safe New Beginnings community center in Tampa next spring. "We're calling it the Glass Project," he told me, a small laugh in his voice. "You know, because that broken glass was the start of everything." I smiled at the name. It was poetic and painful, exactly like healing tends to be. I visit Andy every Sunday. We cook together, his spaghetti sauce has improved, though he still uses too much basil, and talk about everything from his therapy sessions to my stubborn hydrangeas. Sometimes he brings someone new from his volunteer circle. There's a woman he's mentioned a few times lately, Grace. She's kind, gentle, with the kind of steady calm that feels like safety. I can tell she's different. Not a whirlwind like Carly, but a quiet anchor. The kind of person who doesn't take your energy but gives it back to you. He hasn't called it love yet, but I see the lightness in his eyes when he says her name. As for me, I've found my own form of purpose again. After decades behind the bench as a judge, I thought my days of guiding others were done. But last year, Andy convinced me to volunteer as a legal advisor for Safe New Beginnings. Once a week, I sit in a small office downtown, reviewing cases for survivors who can't afford representation, mostly women, but sometimes men too. People who were gaslit into believing they had no rights, no choices, no way out. When they sit across from me, their eyes full of fear and exhaustion, I see echoes of Andy's face from those dark months. And I tell them what I told him. You are not crazy, and you are not trapped. The law may move slowly, but it moves. In quieter hours, I write. Andy says my notes could become a book one day, a mix of memoir and reflection on justice, family, and survival. I haven't decided yet. For now, I keep filling the pages of my leather journal, the one with worn edges and ink stains. Writing helps me make sense of things, the cruelty, the forgiveness, the strange symmetry of pain leading to growth. Some nights, though, I still wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of glass breaking in my dreams. The memory flashes sharp and hot for a moment before dissolving into calm. I get up, make tea, and sit by the window, watching the moonlight reflect off the garden pond. I remind myself that healing isn't a straight line, it's a spiral, circling back through memories until they lose their power. A few months ago, I received a letter from Carly's attorney. She's serving her sentence quietly, participating in therapy and anger management programs. She requested to send an apology letter to Andy through legal channels. He read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in a box without saying much. I didn't ask what it said. Some things belong to closure, not conversation. There's a small scar above my right temple where the glass hit me. It's faint now, barely visible beneath makeup, but I see it every morning in the mirror. I used to wish it would fade completely, but I've come to appreciate it for what it is, a reminder. Not of pain, but of power. It's proof that I survived something designed to break me, and that from it came strength, justice, and a renewed bond between mother and son. Tonight, as the sun sets behind the palm trees, the sky blazes pink and gold over Miami. I pour myself a glass of white wine, not red, and sit on the porch, listening to the evening sounds of crickets and distant laughter. For the first time in years, I feel no tension in my shoulders, no weight in my chest, just peace. Sometimes I think about how strange it is that my story, our story, reached so many people. When Andy first shared it online, I didn't realize it would resonate with thousands. Messages poured in, people saying it gave them courage to leave, to report, to rebuild. Maybe that's what healing really means. Not erasing the past, but using it to light the way for others still walking through the dark. So if you're listening, whoever you are, wherever you are, know this. Life can fall apart in a single night, but it can also rebuild itself one quiet morning at a time. You just have to keep choosing peace over fear, truth over silence. And as I finish this chapter of my life, that's exactly what I intend to do. Now, if you like this story, click subscribe to Stories of Mom Donna and tell me in the comments what moment struck you the most. And don't forget to become a member of Stories of Mom Donna for exclusive videos I don't post anywhere else. I'll be waiting for you there.